Cities under attack by jihadists and rebels, Russian mercenaries in retreat, and a defense minister killed in his own home. Mali in West Africa is facing a challenge that could reshape its history for years to come. But how? What exactly is going on in Mali, and why should it concern you?
If people think it's only about Mali, no, it's not just Mali. If Mali falls, the whole Sahel will follow, and the repercussions will be incalculable.
Ominous warning there from Alioune Tine, founder of the NGO Africa Jom Center. But that's just one aspect of the complexity of the situation in Mali. I'll be speaking to analyst Beverly Ochieng shortly as I try and understand more. But first, the basics. Now, Mali is Africa's 8th largest country with a population of more than 24 million, mostly concentrated in the south, where the capital Bamako is situated. Mali is also young. Almost half the population is under the age of 14. It's also where many travelers find the UNESCO World Heritage Site of Timbuktu. The northern regions are very sparsely populated, and that's part of the reason security has been difficult in a country bordered by 7 other West African nations. The broader context of Mali and its position in the region is that it's part of the Sahel. The Sahel countries form a line across the northern part of Africa. They geographically separate the Saharan desert regions to the north from the savannas to the south. It's a region under many pressures from climate change, poverty, and as we are about to dive into, political instability. Now, over the weekend, the country saw coordinated attacks in various cities by jihadists and separatists. That part is significant, and I'll also look at that in my conversation with Beverly. But perhaps the most high-profile victim of the weekend attacks was the country's defense minister, General Sadio Kamara. His residence in the city of Kati was targeted by a suicide bomber and other attackers. Kamara was seen as the second most powerful figure in the military junta, which had itself seized power in 2020. An overall death toll from the attacks isn't available yet. Now, on Sunday, Russian mercenaries were driven out of the city of Kidal after an attack by separatist Tuareg forces. The Russians, part of the so-called Russia-Africa Corps, are there in Mali in support of the Malian army as it battles Al-Qaeda-linked jihadists and Tuareg separatists. Okay, so lots to unpack here, and to help me do that, I have Beverly Ochieng joining me from Dakar in Senegal. She's a senior analyst with security and intelligence firm Control Risks. Welcome, Beverly. Thanks for making the time. So just at the outset, I'm basically going to be learning from you about what's happening in Mali as we go along. So pardon me if I end up asking some really basic questions here. But earlier, we heard a soundbite from Alioune Tine, who said that if Mali falls, the whole of Sahel will follow. Now, that's around 13 nations in whole or in part. Is that what's at stake here, the future of all the Sahel nations?
I mean, for a long time now, it has felt like that. The insurgency, which started 10 years ago, has been building momentum and is threatening regional countries. There is a big if towards that if Mali were to fall. Of course, there's a big threat towards its military-led government. There's been the push by the militant groups that are behind this weekend siege. There are threats to regional stability in the event that militants do have their way, which they're pushing for a change of government. There's also the counteroffensive and what regional countries do in response to that. So it really hinges on a lot of cross-collaborating factors within Mali and within the regional community. But the stakes are extremely high, and they've never been higher than this weekend.
We're talking about the jihadist insurgency was one part of this situation in Mali. But are you saying that this jihadist insurgency in Mali is also connected with the nations around Mali?
Well, yes. I mean, Somalia has been the epicenter of this insurgency since 2012, but as of 2015, it started to push towards neighboring Burkina Faso in Niger. As of 2019, there were attacks being linked to Malian-based militants in northern Benin, then later on towards northern Togo and northern Cote d'Ivoire. As of last year, Janim claimed some of its first attacks in northwest Nigeria. You can see how expansive that territory is. all the way from Central Sahel towards West African coastal states. Now, whether they're able to hold this territory is one big question. It does mean that they are constraining themselves as a group. They're trying to coordinate with other armed groups and taking advantage of either capacity gaps in security forces, porous borders, poor state presence in certain places to be able to expand and continue coordinating networks.
A very basic question then, why is there jihadist insurgency in Mali?
I mean, it's quite complex. When the insurgency began in 2012, it was being run by separatist groups with the Tuareg community. They had been, since Mali's independence from France in the 1960s, pushing for the autonomy of the northern region and eventually calling for the independence of what they call the state of Azawad. Some of these groups became radicalized, which formed JNIM later on. But what is now known as the Azawad Liberation Front is still a big remnant of that Tuareg separatism, and they continue to push for the autonomy of the north. JNIM, on its part, coalesced in 2017. It was a few groups that were based in northern Mali and also in central Mali from the Tuareg, Fulani communities. They have a more radical agenda. They pledged allegiance to the Al-Qaeda group, the global network. They have been targeting security forces, targeting civilians as well, and pushing for more territory, not just in Mali, but within the region that I just described. Their agendas are now slightly more aligned. They are pushing for a change of government in Mali, but of course, the contention will be on whether that alignment continues in the event that they are to achieve this strategy.
And we'll come to that. But then speaking about these different insurgent groups that you just mentioned, do they have common backers?
I mean, that is often a very contentious issue. If you're looking at some of the social media discourse, there are allegations that they are being supported by France, that they were facilitated by France, and a lot of that is very circumstantial. There was a big push by the French and international forces when they moved into Mali. They were invited by the government in 2013 to be able to push back the militants. There were some concerns that the way France held territory in the north was undermining the sovereignty of the wider government in Mali and now in the Sahel. But more than anything, these groups are capitalizing on their presence in territory. They are in strategic corridors. They are in certain mining areas in the north where there's no industrial operations, but there is artisanal mining. They use that to generate revenue. They're able to access arms across because of cross-border operations. They do take part in a lot of criminal enterprises as a way of sustenance and to access territory and weapons to maintain their hold and pay their own militants as well.
So why this area in the north? Why is that particularly being contested?
Because this is where these groups, their strongholds are based. In terms of the composition of Mali as a whole, the north has always been more for the Tuareg and Arab communities that have lived there. They have felt marginalized from the government that is based in Bamako, which is in the south. Over the years, they've been calling for more representation. The 2015 peace deal was a way of ensuring that political representatives of these separatist groups would be able to run governance in coordination with the Malian government and with the support of UN peacekeepers who were there for stability. But the militant groups had a different agenda. They were pushing for foreign forces to leave the country. They were pushing initially at the time, JNIM, for Sharia to be imposed. And those opposing agendas has led to a rupture and to the insurgency taking place.
You can see that I'm learning as we go along. You were talking about the insurgents there, and at least a part of them, if I understood this correctly, Beverly, emerged from the Tuareg separatists who are there in the north. But there appears to be its own Tuareg separatist movement that also continues to exist along with this insurgency. Am I correct in seeing it that way?
Well, yes, Al-Qaeda, the offshoot in the Sahel, that's JNIM, has coexisted in the north in particular with what is now the FLA. They used to be the Coordination of Movements of Azawad, and we see that there's so many acronyms that you are also coming to learn from this. But as they are now crystallized, you have JNIM, which is the Al-Qaeda affiliate, which has a more radical agenda, although it has been softening the stance over time for a more political coalition. And then you have the FLA, which wants to be the political representatives of the northern region of Mali. So in terms of the agenda, you see where the split is. And while JNIM has operational capacity beyond Mali, across the Sahel, towards parts of West Africa, the FLA remains confined primarily to the north. Even this weekend, you'll notice that the activities were slightly different. The coordination between JNIM and FLA was confined to the northern region of Mali, but JNIM was pushing more towards the military base in Kati, which is just near the capital, as well as the airport in Bamako.
I'm just so glad that you're completely across the board with all of these acronyms and all these groups, because there is no way I would have understood any of this. So thanks again for making the time. And just talking about, this coordination that you referred to over there, because the reporting on these attacks over the weekend is that the jihadists and the separatists got together and attacked cities across the country. You were saying it was primarily in the north, but then is this the first time that we've had some sort of a joint cooperation between these different groups? And if that is indeed the case, how should we interpret this?
I'd say it's the first time that they were both acknowledging that they are cooperating together to fight against the military government in Mali. There has been a much less pronounced cooperation, or at least areas where they are tactically carrying out operations in parallel. One example of that was in 2024, where there was this big attack on Russian paramilitaries and the Malian army in the town of Tinzawaten. Both the FLA and JNIM separately claimed responsibility for this attack. But you do see how it is that they're able to coalesce in an area where they have tactical advantages. Since the peace deal, the 2015 peace deal, was abrogated by the military government in 2023, there has been an alignment in intent. When the Malian army was pushing for control of the north, getting into Kidal, getting into Gao and various other towns in the north, there were separate attacks being carried out by JNIM and by the then Azawad coalition, which were aimed at forestalling the military's capacity to be able to take over the north. But yes, this is the first time we're seeing attacks at scale where they are acknowledging a cooperation and an intent in terms of unity.
So what is this unity heading to? What is the final aim here? To kick the army or any remnant of control from Bamako away from the north, and after that has been done, then to try and figure out what comes next? Is that the game plan?
I mean, it's more complicated than that, of course, as you've come to see from our conversation. But ultimately, they would want anyone else in power than the military government that is currently in place. For the FLA, it's in particular because of the abrogation of that peace deal and because of a lack of acknowledgement by this government of the role that they want to play in the northern region. For JNIM, it's a lot more complex. It's not just easy as them coming in and saying that they are the new powers in Mali and that everyone has to now sort of, toe the line with them. They don't have support in parts where the military government has had a long lifeline of support in the south. They are seen as being responsible for widespread violence in the region. It's very difficult for people to then suddenly say, we want to work with JNIM under the circumstances, with the rate and pace of the insurgency and the various losses that we have seen. With JNIM, they're trying to coalesce another coalition as well, reaching out to as many interlocutors as they can. So in their latest statement, they did say that they look forward to a future cooperation with Russia, which was interesting because they have been fighting Russia all along since their deployment in 2021. They have engaged with political actors in Mali, including opposition coalitions that are currently in exile, with the thinking around dialogue and power sharing. But this is likely to be a divisive issue because of its role in the violent occupation in parts of Mali, but also because of the various misgivings across the country on what it means for Mali to actually ensure that it has national territorial consolidation and reconciliation.
My God, Beverly, the complexity around this is just mind-boggling. So thanks so much for being patient with my questions. And I'm hoping that our viewers are also being patient with trying to absorb what is happening in Mali. We've talked a lot about the army and the role over here. I have a number of questions to do with the army. From the way you describe it, talking about the abrogation of the peace deal that happened in 2015, and then the army abrogated that in 2023, if I've understood you correctly, it would seem to suggest that the army, in a way, encouraged further momentum in this insurgency, and that is, and the result of that we are seeing in the form of these weekend attacks. Would that be a fair assessment?
I mean, it's a very sensitive spot for the army, definitely, for it to even be framed in that way. The security vacuum, definitely, in Mali, especially when they called for the exit of French UN forces and the fact that the army wasn't quite able to take territory as quickly, is one of the underlying reasons for why this insurgency has continued to entrench itself while also expanding into areas where it wasn't happening before. Another issue is the capacity building within the military forces themselves, as well as how they're able to either broker agreements with armed groups or find a way of facilitating operational coordination with them. There had been underway the demobilization and the integration of these Tuareg separatists into the army. This didn't happen, and it's part of the reason why the peace deal crumbled. There had been concerns around how this political power sharing or autonomy will look like, and whether this poses a legitimacy challenge to the military that's in power in Bamako. So there are all these issues to take into play. There's the fact that even though Russia came in to present itself as a bulwark towards security, so far this hasn't been the case, and we're seeing a continued push in the south. There's also the fact that the regional community felt a bit awkward about how to engage with Mali in a circumstance whereby the government had pulled out of the Western Bloc, the West African Bloc, ECOWAS. It had pushed away some of its former Western allies and was seeking to consolidate internal opinion on how to deal with the insurgency. So it's not just as simple as the military failed and so the insurgency spread. It was a combination of factors that has led to this sort of state of heightened stability or instability and operational risks.
Okay, so let me just explore that a bit. And I do want to talk about the role that Russia is playing, or at least Russian mercenaries are playing further on in our conversation. But then just staying with the army, in 2020, the army seized power. And one of the reasons it said it was seizing power was to fight the insurgency, right? And what we've seen over the weekend, it appears that the army was caught completely off guard by these nationwide attacks. It doesn't appear to have, I don't know, seen it coming. At least that's what it looks like to an outsider. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong. I mean, if that assessment is true, Beverly, what does that mean for the legitimacy of the army amongst the eyes of the people? Because the people ultimately feel the impact of the insurgency. Here is the army that came to power saying we're going to fight them, but they have been attacked in this fashion over the weekend.
Well, yeah, there's bound to be grievances over the legitimacy of the military government because they did stake their claim to power towards fighting against the militants. There are going to be concerns about the capacity gaps that seem to be emerging within the military. And it's not just about this weekend's attacks, but it's also about the sort of build up towards this. In 2024, there was an attack at the airport. You know, in July last year, there were coordinated attacks in the western and southern region, which have more or less built into what has happened this weekend, but at a much larger scale. But there is still support for the army in the very pragmatic sense that it is the only way that they will be able to overcome the insurgency by providing that patriotic support to the army. So over the weekend, through social media, there were videos of people talking about how they were spending their curfew indoors and trying to be safe despite the emergency. There were people who were calling for support for the army because they're the ones who will protect them against these militant groups. There was also some anger towards Janim itself, which builds to the whole thing. We're talking about their popularity or their acceptability for being able to continue carrying out this level and scale of attacks. But of course, there will be long-term questions, even within the junta itself, the cohesion of the military, its ability to, reestablish control in strategic areas will definitely come under question in the coming days. How much of a hold it has will determine the lifeline of the military government and the future of Mali.
In terms of the future of Mali and the support for the military, we appear to be talking about Russian mercenaries as well being in the picture, because we saw images of these mercenaries being allowed to leave the city of Kidal following fighting. I don't know if I pronounced the name of the city correctly, but if not, please feel free to correct me, Beverly. Can you talk about the role of Russian mercenaries here? What are they doing in Mali?
Well, according to the government, the Russian paramilitaries, or what they call military instructors, are there to train the army and to be able to provide additional support. But since their deployment in 2020, they have been actively engaged in side-by-side counterinsurgency operations with the Malian armed forces, primarily in the central region and in the north. And in fact, that's what culminated eventually in the 2023 retaking of Kidal from the Tuareg separatists by the Malian army. They have, in some ways, in the past, at least before when they were as the Wagner Group, they were accused of being quite heavy-handed in their tactics, targeting civilians sometimes, but also a sense of lack of discipline in how they used to operate. Increasingly now, as the Africa Corps, they are directly being overseen by the Russian Defense Ministry, as well as the Malian interim president, Assimi Goïta. Their deployments have been a little bit slower, a little bit more about getting concessions before moving to the front line. What happened in Kidal is quite interesting because it does demonstrate the flexibility within the Russian paramilitaries themselves. And I'd say where they operate, they tend to be like this. When the Wagner Group declared it was leaving, the group or the militants, the forces that formed the Wagner Group easily folded into Africa Corps. Some of them left, but they moved on with this new arrangement, right? In the event that this military is not able to sustain a sense of longevity, it wouldn't be surprising if the Russian paramilitary, the Africa Corps, was to simply switch sides if it suits its geopolitical ambitions or Russia's geopolitical ambitions. For now, Russia wants to demonstrate that it will support the military with counterinsurgency, but ultimately it is also there for its own geopolitical interests.
So let me get this right. I keep using the term Russian mercenaries because that is how the reporting has been ascribed to the presence of Russian paramilitaries in Mali. Would that be an incorrect term? Because as you just described, the Africa Corps is controlled by the Russian Defense Ministry. So this is basically Russian troops in effect in Mali, correct?
It's a lot more complicated because I think in Russian law, and I'm not a Russian expert, despite speaking a bit of the language, in Russian law, I think they're not really allowed to deploy outside of the country. Okay. And for a long time, the Wagner Group, which had been there before, was a sort of scapegoat towards that, whereby Russia is able to benefit from its geostrategic presence and maybe some economic concessions, not just in Mali, but across, parts of Africa. So the Central African Republic, Sudan, parts of Burkina Faso, Niger, now Mali, that they're able to benefit from some of the economic concessions that come from having a force in the country or in these countries, while not taking responsibility for them. The Africa Corps is meant to sort of professionalize this, but still create a bit of a distance. They are seen as training forces, not necessarily a combat mission, which is quite interesting. The way they're paid is very opaque, or what this engagement is still remains quite opaque, but there have been reports previously of budgetary allocations towards paying for the services of Russian paramilitaries. And yes, I mean, in terms of technical political phrasing, if you think about it, it's more or less that they're being hired to be able to fight against militant and armed groups. So it is, reporting will obviously frame them as mercenaries. In terms of their strategic presence in the country, it goes beyond just fighting groups, because we have seen the patterns with which they operate are sometimes heavy-handed in some places. It's for their own footprint in certain areas. It's on the command sometimes of either their central commanders in the country or the military forces. But the issue is attribution for any incidents, especially concerns around human rights, is challenging. And it means that reputation for people who are operating in Mali, in considering where the Africa Corps is deployed, is also another risk.
All right, there's just so much information here, and it's just so great that you've been able to sort of distinguish the various aspects and the various threads of this conflict. Beverly, I just have one final question, therefore. So after these weekend attacks that we saw, in which the power of the junta was challenged in a sense, where does that leave Mali? I mean, what happens now? What do you think is going to happen next?
So the thing is, it's a variety of scenarios. The best case initially had been that the military will have a very fragile hold on power, that they will continue to face attacks. Of course, the scale of this weekend's attacks means that the fragility risks now considerably increase. And we may be moving towards a possibility of another intervention, especially if the counterinsurgency strategy is not as effective, or if the whereabouts of the interim president, Assimi Goïta, remain unknown, as well as the army chief. They have already lost their second in command, that's the defense minister, Sadio Kamara. He was behind the counterinsurgency strategy, which is quite a significant loss, symbolic as well, that he is the latest victim of a strategy that he tried to drive. Another thing is we may see some defections in the northern region in the long term, depending on how long Jenim is able to hold strategic towns like Kidal, Gao, Aguelhok, and others. Defections from the army likely towards either Jenim or the FLA as a way of continuing this alliance of convenience. In the south, a lot more challenging. We are seeing the opposition in Mali calling for the military to hand over power and to seek ways out of this crisis by engaging with civilian coalitions. These civilian coalitions are more than willing to engage in dialogue, in particular with Jenim, as a way of either meeting power concessions or power sharing. These movements will take a bit of time to cement and crystallize. The risks to neighboring countries will still prevail. So in the event that we have spillover threats, either increasing, whether it's here in Senegal, where at the border they have been on alert since July when the attacks started taking place near the border, whether it's countries like Burkina Faso and Niger, where the insurgency heightens, whether it's even northern Cote d'Ivoire through the southern corridors of Mali or northern Benin and Togo, they will all be on alert. And the regional community is definitely concerned. Having an insurgent group at the center of power in a strategic country is bound to be a security and political threat for them and for their lifeline.
Pretty comprehensive there, Beverly. Thanks so much for joining us today. Beverly Ochieng from Control Risks.
Thank you so much for having me as well. I hope this was helpful.
This was very helpful. Thank you so much.